Perfect. So everyone, thank you for joining. This call is recorded and we'll have a playback available for everyone afterwards. But for everyone attending live, it's a pleasure having you on here. We have two very special guests with us today. And before I get going, just a quick little bit of housekeeping. If anyone does need to ask any questions, you can submit it via the chat function on the bar, or you can unmute yourself and we'll happily answer them. And we'll also have like a vocal Q&A. Obviously, this call is mostly from myself, Mark, and Cliff, and what our guests, Jonathan, Greg, educational. It's not really to be giving you investment advice or anything of that nature. It's more informational on that side there. And then throughout the call, you might see me mute you here and there just for background noises. But then outside of that, you can always unmute if you do have a question. But without further ado, we have two very special guests, one out of Toronto and one out of Washington, D.C., which we're happy to get in front of our clients once again. And I'll let Mark give a little bit of background on our guests.
So yeah, we'll start with Greg, who's the top one on here. So Greg is the chief U.S. policy strategist and has been with AGF since 2019. Prior to his time at AGF, Greg has been following Washington issues for institutional and retail investors and has spent time on major networks such as CNN, CNBC, BNN, and Bloomberg. Over the last 40 years, Greg has been analyzing policy and politics around the world and providing commentary on Washington and special coverage of the Federal Reserve. So obviously, election year in the U.S., we're really excited to hear Greg's take on where things stand and where things might be going there. We are also joined by Jonathan Lowe, who is the Vice President of Growth Equities at AGF. He's been with AGF for over 12 years and works in their growth suite with them. Jonathan works very closely with Tony Janua, the face of the flagship AGF American Growth Class. And Jonathan has an MBA from Oxford University and a Bachelor of Science from Seton Hall University. Very happy to have him.
Perfect. And many people might know Jonathan from the AGF Gold Select also. He's talked on that portfolio and has an active role on that mandate. And we've done some presentations in the past, and they've always been a little bit of, I think, more your traditional presentation with a lot of slides. But we have done a presentation a few years back with Greg, where it's more of a Q&A. It's more of a discussion. And that's kind of what we're going to have today. There's, like Mark mentioned, a lot of topics on the U.S. upcoming election. And how does the politics play in Greg's backyard and his experience there, and we'll kind of touch on how that impacts the markets. But it will be more of an open format. So maybe what I'll actually end up doing is just kind of opening up the conversation with the topic of the upcoming election. And I think for many people, that election topic is Biden and Trump, because it looks like a rematch of these two individuals. But because the auction is so heavily focused on Biden and Trump, I actually want to start with a third person, Robert Kennedy, which looks like he's running a third party candidacy. And I want to ask Greg real quickly how the feedback is coming in on Robert Kennedy, what the potential impact might be on the election of having him on there as a third party candidate.
Well, first of all, great to be with you. Thank you for having me. Second of all, you can't make this stuff up. It's a story, a narrative that is unlike any that I've ever seen in my long career. And Robert F. Kennedy could be a factor. In latest polls, he's coming in at 7, 8, 9%. That's really quite impressive for a third-party candidate. I think that he's going to be under withering criticism from the White House in particular because of his views on vaccines. He has very unusual views on vaccines. He is despised by virtually everyone in the Kennedy family. So it's going to get nasty. But the point I've been making lately is that in the very controversial election of the year 2000, when Ralph Nader denied Florida to George W. Bush and or Al Gore, Ralph Nader only had 4%. And here you've got Robert F. Kennedy, maybe close to double that. So I think you could make a case that in a handful of states, Robert F. Kennedy could make all the difference in the world, which further scrambles an election that already is looking pretty weird, an election that to me is close to a tie. So if you've got close to a tie and Robert F. Kennedy, you've got a prescription for a very volatile election.
It's fascinating. And he did recently announce his running mate, which I think pulls a little bit more to the left side of the U.S. political spectrum. Is that where you see, I know he has some controversial views, but do you see his votes mostly coming from, let's say, the Democrats or more the Republicans, or where do you think he might pull more of a support from?
Hard to say. I've read a lot of the polls, and they do show that some of the voters are initially Biden supporters who would go over to Robert F. Kennedy Jr. But since the anti-vaccine people are more on the right, it could take some votes away from Trump. Still too early to say. I would like to see another couple of months of polls before knowing exactly. But again, it could be a significant factor in the election.
Perfect. And is there, going back to, I guess, Biden and Trump is, I know it's still early days, but is there anything you've seen that sounds like a drastic campaign type of promise from either political party that might impact the economy or anything that making any grand promises that can make any fundamental shifts, or is it more of kind of the same that we're hearing?
Well, I tell you, I think that Joe Biden has some problems, not just his age. He would be 86 years old when leaving the White House if he filled a second term. It's more than just age, it's immigration, which is a huge negative for the Democrats. It's urban crime, another big negative for the Democrats. And this anxiety, which continues over inflation. Inflation has come down, but it hasn't come down enough. So I think that could be a problem too for Biden. Biden has some pluses, though. He's got a lot of money. He's raised more money than Trump, even after Trump's big haul of last night or the night before. Biden also can talk about Obamacare. Trump is saying he wants to kill it, and he has no alternative. Uh, and I think that Biden will argue that Obamacare is quite popular. But the big issue of all, the big wild card, is abortion. This is a big albatross for the Republicans. They're strident on this, and most Americans are not. And if the Republicans don't soften their stance on this, it could be a game changer in the election.
Well, that's a fair one. And do you think Trump seems like the type that'll toe the Republican line on kind of being against abortion, or do you think he might try to pull more to the center on that issue?
He's making a speech this morning. I haven't seen it yet, so we'll see just where he is on that. I would say, though, I just want to get this in. If the election were held tonight, Trump would win. We've still got 7 or 8 months to go, and that's a lifetime in politics, and things could change. But I look at polls pretty aggressively, and in all of the key battleground states, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Arizona, Nevada, Georgia, in all of these states, Trump leads, not by a lot, but by 4 or 5 percentage points consistently right across the board. And I think Biden has to worry that three really key constituencies have moved away from him. The young people, they're indifferent to him. African Americans, not enthused. And Hispanic voters are nearly 50-50 in the election. These are big shifts in the last few years. And if these groups continue to be lukewarm toward Biden, Biden's got real problems.
One thing we've told a lot of clients is there's never been, from my understanding, someone who's won the White House with under 40% approval. And my
Yeah.
understanding is Biden is under that marker. Am I correct or wrong on that one?
Yes, he is. Of course, Trump's approval ratings aren't very good either. And as I travel around the country, I get a almost unanimous opinion from people that they would like another choice. And a lot of people, I thought that Nikki Haley could have been that other choice. She's relatively young in her mid-50s. She's quick. She's funny. She's very bright. She's fairly moderate. I thought she would have made a great candidate. And to my astonishment, in the last few days, Donald Trump has kept up an endless barrage of criticism of Nikki Haley. That makes no sense. Trump needs Nikki Haley's voters. Those moderate voters, those centrist voters, are probably going to be the key to the election.
Yeah. And I guess in a very cheesy, joking kind of way, just like the eclipse, you don't want to stare at it too long. I'm assuming a lot of people don't want to stare at politics too long. But
Right.
eventually the reality will come home in several months, probably after the summer is when people start waking up to it. If there is this angst where the answer is none of the above when it comes to voting for Biden or Trump, Do you think, to loop back to RF Kennedy, do you think there is a possibility that he'll be able to take even more voters? Or like, where do you think as a third party candidate he could rank? Would he be the able to get above
Yeah,
10% maybe? I know the US is not built for a third party candidacy, but do you think there'll be more
correct.
momentum his way?
It's unlikely, in my opinion, that Kennedy will get even close to 10%. I think he'll get 4 or 5, which is impressive, but I don't know that he's going to get much more. Eventually, the country's going to have to acknowledge, the country will be resigned that it's either Trump or Biden. These are not real palatable choices. So I tend to think it's going to be a campaign of gaffes, of errors. I think every 2 or 3 days, there'll be a new gaffe, a gaffe from Biden, a gaffe from Trump. Both of them are notorious for that. So it's a volatile race. And I would just say, guys, I think that the greatest fear that the markets have to worry about is that this could be roughly a tie. Uh, I've seen that movie before. I saw that movie 4 years ago. Nobody wants to see that movie again. And if it's basically a tie, I guarantee you there'll be calls for recounts. There'll be allegations of voter irregularities, and this may not be decided on November 5th. It might drag on throughout November into December. We've had a couple of examples before, and I think for the financial markets and our allies abroad, the idea that we have a tie without a clear winner is not a good story.
Kind of shifting to that broad topic. I know in past calls we touched on China and relationships getting worse with the US. Part of it was the trade wars that Trump did have with China, but it has persisted under Biden in a sense of having not the coziest relationship. From an economic standpoint, any concerns on the China front with relations with the US? Do you see things getting worse, staying the same, getting better?
Great question. I think if Trump should win, he will try to impose even more tariffs on the Chinese. I think U.S.-China relations would deteriorate further. I think if Trump should win, his relations with Jerome Powell, the Fed chairman, will be so ugly that Powell, I think, will get forced out of office. I think Trump will call him up and say, "I can't work with you. I want you out." And I think Powell would leave. There are many issues. The positive issue for the markets is regulatory policy. I think it would be very laissez-faire. I think people who are concerned about energy, healthcare, telecom, antitrust, all of the classic antitrust stories, I think would be less aggressive under Trump than they would be if Biden should win a second term.
And Jonathan, when you're thinking of just to kind of shift pages a little bit, when you're looking at investment portfolios, if we do head into a world where there might be a little bit less regulation, maybe a little bit more pro-American kind of focus economically, do you think the markets are pricing that in at the moment? Are they possibly pricing in a Trump victory, or is the markets kind of just ignoring the election at this stage?
I think it kind of ebbs and flows a bit. I mean, we watch like so-called Trump baskets and the Biden baskets, and they sort of oscillate back and forth depending on who has political momentum. I think, when you look at election years, the one thing that we've observed is that there does tend to be a rise in volatility in the summer months during those election years leading up to the election. So, we've had a great start to the market so far this year. We haven't, on average, 5% corrections happen 3.5 times per year. We haven't had one yet, so we will get one at some point. I think that's highly likely. But at the same time, election years are also, for the most part, very positive for stock markets as well. I think the last time that there's been a negative year, anytime there's been an incumbent president running, was 1940, and actually the average calendar year return for election years is something like 16%. So, it tends to be pretty good. So, I think that the market, I think when it comes to the election and the markets, stocks do well no matter who wins. And when you look at the history of election years, the best outcomes have generally been associated when there's been a bit of a split outcome, meaning like, one party takes the White House, there's a split control over Congresses, whether that's a House, a Republican House and a Democrat Senate, or the other way around. So those kind of split scenarios, have tended to have the best setups. Republican sweeps have been a little bit lower, and then Democrat sweeps have been a little bit lower than that. But in all instances, they've been positive and pretty positive. So I think stocks do well in pretty much any scenario. But what it could look different would be, what sectors would lead. So, you start off your question about what we see in the markets. If Trump wins, I think you see energy doing well. Greg touched on some of the GOP policies towards deglobalization. So I think reshoring, to the extent that there's been companies recently benefiting from the trend around reshoring, industrial companies, semi-cap companies, they're going to continue to do well. We also think that, with Trump, you're going to see a continued and greater focus on security and law enforcement. So those kinds of companies will see tailwinds. I think it's usually Republican administrations have been positive historically for smaller cap companies as well. Small business optimism has tended to do well in the Republican administration. So small caps probably do well in a Republican administration. Meanwhile, if Biden wins, you probably see the tailwind for the beneficiaries of the IRA bill that we saw a couple of years ago. So that's everything from electric vehicles to battery storage to renewable energy. Defense stocks actually have been trading within the Biden basket a little bit more, which is a little bit of a departure from elections in the past, and that's because Trump has more of an isolationist posture than Biden. So I think you could see underneath the market, what stocks do well versus others, but the overall market, has done well historically in every instance, and we have some great secular trends that are going to be propelling the market higher no matter who wins.
And when you're kind of looking at, let's say, obviously we're talking about the political bucket, but then Greg lightly touched on the inflation bucket, and then obviously when you're talking new technologies like AI and things of the sort, if you were to kind of rank the political side, would you rank it in kind of number one spot in the markets, or would you more be in the mindset that it's kind of a lower bucket and stories like moderating inflation, stronger economy, or kind of advances in technology? What would you say would be the top two things driving the recent market run of the last few months?
Well, in our view, there's two main factors that drive market leadership. So one is the bottom-up perspective, meaning that, like, for companies, we want to see them demonstrating innovation. I think innovation's been a big part of what's been driving the recent rally. We talk about AI. There's a lot of excitement in the healthcare industry around the obesity drugs, what we call the GLP-1 drugs. So like Ozempic and Mounjaro and drugs like that. So these are all innovative companies, and I think the second biggest factor really has to do with the macroeconomic environment, in particular where are we in the cycle, and does the macro environment represent a headwind or a tailwind for the kinds of companies that we own in the portfolio. I would say those are the two biggest drivers of the stock market and of security prices. But that's not to say that politics doesn't matter. It does. To the extent that politics influences things like fiscal spend. We've had a fiscal tailwind in many places recently. Politics obviously impacts the geopolitical environment, which has profound impacts on things like trade, things like commodity prices, which in turn impact things like inflation. So I think all of it is important. We take a mosaic approach here at AGF, where we try to consider pretty much everything. And what we try to do is focus on the most important factors that will drive that particular securities prices. But, what we spend a lot of time doing is really looking from the bottom up on individual securities, as well as evaluating, the top-down environment, the macro environment, and where we are in the cycle.
So when you're doing
I might add,
yep, go for it.
If I could very quickly add another point, I agree with what Jonathan said, but I would add, I do think geopolitics will be a wild card in this election, whether it's Israel, Hamas, whether it's the Iranians who are looking more and more agitated, whether it's Ukraine, which I think will get more aid. But I do think this will be an election where Biden and Trump will have clear differences. Trump is saying he can solve Ukraine in a day. I think that's a little bit optimistic, but I think that these geopolitical stories will be significant.
Do you think, I know there's obviously certain talks in the media, but do you think Trump would quickly try to push for peace given his relationships in the past, where he had more of a, I don't want to call it a friendly relationship with Putin, because he did bomb a Russian air base in Syria during his administration. But do you think he'll be quick to try to just cool relations off and move away from pushing aid to Ukraine? What do you think could happen with Ukraine, I guess, depending on which administration gets elected?
It's a really interesting issue. There's a big story in this morning's Washington Post talking about Trump trying to come up with a deal for Zelensky. The deal would require the Ukrainians to give up a lot of territory in the east and parts of Crimea. I think that's a non-starter for Zelensky, but Trump will have a plan. And I do think that this and Hamas and the Iranians will be a volatile mix as we head into the election.
And just because on our side, we're here in Canada, on your side, you're in the US, what do you feel the appetite is, let's say for the average person, for continued pressures on Russia, continued conflict? I know early on, Ukraine had a tremendous amount of support throughout the American populace, but the impression is that it has been waning. Do you think that the US public has that continued fervor to keep pushing Russia forward, or do you think that they want to find an easier solution out of the problem?
That is a really key area. And I think that you're seeing more and more young Americans saying, enough already. You know, we can't keep spending $60 billion at a shot to give aid to Ukraine. We can't spend all this money on the Middle East, especially as Israel gets into very controversial territory with civilian casualties. So for the first time in my career, I'm seeing a mood of isolationism. It was dominant in the US in the 1930s in the Midwest, but here we are now seeing that. And as Jonathan mentioned, this will have an impact on defense spending. You're going to have a liberal Democrat, Joe Biden, spending more money on defense than a conservative Republican, Donald Trump. And that is a big switch from recent patterns.
Interesting. And so that makes sense to Jonathan's point when he's talking about the various baskets that the defense companies tend to be more in favor when it looks like Biden's doing well. And if Trump is doing well, defense companies might not be looking as interesting to invest in, I guess you could say. And looking at an isolationist idea, let's say if we do go to a path where it's more North American hemisphere, less trade with China per se, and you're doing more onshoring, obviously that brings more construction, more work. We touched slightly on AI. Could AI be just a way of making companies more efficient to be able to deal with the onshoring, or dealing with the fact that we're maybe doing more domestically than we would be doing internationally?
Yeah, I can take this one. I mean, I think AI is going to make us more productive for sure over the long run. You know, we're actually, I just wrote a note on AI, and it has to do with the idea that, you know, we're actually just starting, I would say, maybe the second inning of AI. You know, the first was really all excitement around NVIDIA and the GPU chips, and for good reason. I mean, like when you look at NVIDIA's revenue, you know, in the first quarter of 2023, the company's revenue was $6 billion. Well, in the first quarter of 2024, the company's revenue was $22 billion. So, I mean, this is a company that grew 3.5 times in a year. And so they've really seen the monetization benefit from everybody buying GPU chips in order to, you know, train these models. But I think this year we're really on the cusp of, you know, other ideas. And so, you know, there's a lot of other kinds of companies that also benefit. They're not all in technology, in the sense that, you know, when you have all these GPUs, all these chips going into data centers, these data centers need to be built. First of all, they need to be housed somewhere. They need to be powered. They need to be cooled, because these are very energy intensive chips. You know, they're about 7 times more intensive than the older chips. So you know, when the heat in a data center gets above a certain threshold, air is no longer sufficient to cool those racks. You need liquid cooling. So, you know, that I'm trying to explain that how AI is really spawning a whole new set of opportunities. And that doesn't even include the companies that, you know, have AI applications. We haven't gotten there yet. You know, I think like, you know, Microsoft is probably the first company that's rolled out, you know, a service that we actually pay for in Copilot and in OpenAI's ChatGPT. But a lot of those applications are coming. They're either going to be, you're going to either have to pay for them, or they'll be bundled into premium offerings that you already pay for. Those will be productivity gainers, right? I don't know if anybody online has used Copilot yet. Here at AGF, we're kind of playing around with it. It's I think it's $30 or $40 a month per user, but it's going. I mean, in time, as we all figure out how to use it, it's going to save everyone a lot of time and a lot of effort. Because my belief is that everybody in the knowledge economy is going to be using some form of AI within, I would say, 18 months or so. So that's going to result in productivity gains. I think when you look at productivity in the U.S. in particular, where many of these innovative companies reside, it's really accelerated, since the pandemic. Here in Canada, we actually have a bit of a productivity issue. But in the U.S., where a lot of this innovation is occurring, we're seeing productivity expand. That will eventually make its way throughout, to other users of AI around the world.
That's quite exciting. It does remind me of, if you go mid-90s, the idea of the internet, this exciting new technology that's going to impact all our lives, and we're all trying to figure out how it will. There was a kind of many years of runway where we kind of saw this expansion grow. But it still did take many years for that to percolate. It feels like with AI, it's moving a bit quicker. Do you think, how much do you think might change in, let's say, even the next 12 months, 24 months? Or do you think will still take longer, kind of like the internet took a good 5 to 10 years in some cases to really bake itself into the system?
Yeah, that's a great point, Mario. So in the internet age, we had the internet bubble in the late 90s and the early 2000s, and that was really predicated on a lot of excitement around what we call the picks and shovels players of the internet. And in that case, it was the Ciscos of the world, the Nortels of the world, the companies that were providing the telecom equipment, right, and the fiber optics to lay down the infrastructure for the internet. But it wasn't until, if you think about it, it wasn't until maybe a decade later that the real applications of the internet emerged. It wasn't until Facebook and Google, emerged, many years later. You had other companies like Uber and Airbnb emerge even later after that, so it took like 10, 15 years before, the full benefit of the infrastructure layer, came about and was evident to society. I think with AI, you're going to sequentially see the same sort of thing, in that the initial beneficiaries of AI have been around the picks and shovels layer, the NVIDIAs of the world, right? The semiconductor chips. Now it's around infrastructure. So the data center infrastructure companies are doing well right now. And then eventually down the line, we'll have the applications, right? The companies that have innovated and come out with AI applications that you and I will use on a day-to-day basis. That's coming later. But I think it's also coming at an accelerated rate. We're not going to have to wait, 10, 15 years to see this happen. It's going to come, in the next couple of years, because the pace of innovation that we're seeing in the AI arena is really, really tremendous. It's really leaps and bounds faster than what we saw during the internet age. So, I think it's really, really exciting in terms of the compute power that we have, and it's especially exciting when you think about the convergence of many of these trends. Like, take for instance in healthcare, right? So in healthcare, we have more data than we've ever had. And the reason we have more data than we've ever had is because we've had things like genomics, right, and genome sequencing machines, whereby the first human genome took like hundreds of billions of dollars and like something like 15 years to sequence. Now you can do it on one of these machines in a couple hours and $500, right? So the amount of data that's available to us from a healthcare perspective is more than we've ever had before in history, by leaps and bounds, by orders of magnitude. And if you combine that with the compute power that we're developing with AI, and you combine those two things, you converge those two ideas together, we're going to have a really exciting period ahead in drug development, in our belief. We're going to have an accelerated pace of drug development, because companies will be able to, formulate molecules and test things at a much more rapid and efficient pace than they ever have before. So I think it's really exciting. AI is really ushering in an innovation in all kinds of different sectors and in different areas.
Cool.
And Jonathan, I just add one very quick point. I don't see any aggressive AI regulation coming out of Washington anytime soon. As I joke, most members of Congress can't even figure out Wi-Fi. let alone AI. So I think we got a ways to go before there's a regulatory threat.
Do you find the Biden administration, let's say, with antitrust litigation with, let's say, Apple, Google, and some of these companies, is it just a case where they're kind of picking out some of the more hated names? I think that's one thing that both parties kind of agree to, is they get annoyed with big tech to an extent, like if you think of Facebook, Google, Apple. Any concerns on a knee-jerk reaction to say, okay, we want to try to control AI, so we'll go after Google, but they completely miss the whole idea of AI and how it's percolating in other ways? Or do you think it's just talking points and a nothing burger?
I think it's talking points. I think that they have so much on their plate that this is probably not going to be a dominant issue for them.
Yeah, I think that any kind of regulatory regime for AI will have to be an international effort. It's
Yeah.
you know, the comparison I've heard it being made to would be like a nuclear proliferation deal, for instance, because
Mhm.
I mean, everybody's very cognizant that you don't want the AI talent to go somewhere else, right? And I do think actually we're quite a ways away from what they call AGI, which is artificial general intelligence, which is the idea, you know, it's basically what you see in Terminator movies, where there's a sentient robot and, you know, they're looking out for their own survival. You know, I think that's quite, we're not anywhere close to that point yet. So there's still time, but to the extent, you know, I think that is one area that that many people have cautioned against, and one where, you know, some regulation is probably required at some point in order to put some guardrails in place for such an outcome.
And with the lack of there being like an international order on AI or kind of restrictions, do you find there's a place geopolitically or from a part of the world that has a head start on it? Is it the US mainly that's leading the pace right now? Or are there any threats from, let's say, China or Europe or other parts of the world that could leap above the US on kind of that front? Or
No, the U.S. is definitely the leader when it comes to AI. I mean, and partially because of the chips, actually. You know, the restrictions on the chips that the U.S. put on China is going to be pretty restrictive of on, you know, the degree of innovation at least at the leading edge that China can make. Right now, China still has an inventory of existing chips that they had bought before some of these restrictions that they can run off of. But as we progress into more and more powerful chips, you know, they're gonna be behind on that basis. I heard a recent podcast from the Alibaba CEO who estimated that, you know, China is going to be perpetually about maybe 2 years behind. Now China is developing their own chips, but that's going to take some time. And, you know, it's going to take a lot of time to catch up to NVIDIA. But so I think with AI that, you know, I think the US is the clear leader, you know, by leaps and bounds. There's certainly, you know, I think the ecosystem of AI is more, it transcends geographic boundaries. So in Europe, you know, they're also going to benefit from AI. You know, there's some European companies, like we have ASML in the portfolio, which is a semiconductor. They make they're a semi-cap company, so they make the etching tools that are required for semiconductor production and lithography tools. So, you know, I think that, you know, Europe's going to participate in that, but, you know, by and large, the biggest player is definitely the US and the most influential player.
and maybe off to Greg on this one, but we had chatted about actually I did have a question on this one, just put it here. So sorry, let me actually. I got a question from someone that asked, will AI impact employment? Does the average person understand the influence of AI on their lives? That's a great question. I'd segue that question actually into the idea of the impact of technology has on inflation. Because if we looked at kind of the internet and technology, it's talking about productivity and how it impacted people. I always do the wisecrack of Blockbuster. My kid will never work part-time at a Blockbuster. That's not a career that he can now enjoy and fulfill. He's 12 and he has no idea what a Blockbuster even is. But at their peak, Blockbuster had 87,000 employees. And I think Netflix, which destroyed Blockbuster, has 9,000 employees. So I think that's an example of technology innovation eliminating work. Is it fair to assume that AI will likely do the same that other companies have done with technology in the past, where it will displace some workers?
Yeah, I can take this one.
Jonathan, yeah.
Yes, AI will definitely replace some workers. I mean, that's what happens with every disruption and every innovation. Those workers, in turn, in a dynamic economy, get retrained and they find new work. That's generally what happens. In fact, we're already seeing it happen. So, there's a company in Sweden called Klarna. Klarna is one of the Swedish unicorns. So it's actually it's actually a private company. And what they do is they're a payments company. So Klarna actually announced in late February that they had introduced an AI assistant powered by OpenAI. So basically, when you call into a call center for this company, you get an AI assistant. Now, this AI assistant handled 2.3 million conversations over the past 3 months. That's 2/3 of their inbound calls. So it's doing the equivalent work of about 700 agents. And it's more accurate in terms of resolutions. They're leading to faster resolutions, better resolutions, and it drove about $40 million in profit for Klarna over that period. So this is happening. You know, people will lose their jobs, some of them now, and that's part of disruption. But you know, so on the other hand, so the market is also reflecting this, right? So you know, on the same day that Klarna announced this, you had stocks like Teleperformance, which is a French stock. What they do is they run call centers, and guess what happened to that stock that day? It was down, you know, about $40 billion in market cap on that same announcement. So the market is reflecting that. Now, AI is also going to lead to new jobs. It's going to lead to more productivity, right? So you know, I think that you know there's increasingly a demand for people who can prompt AIs and steer AI to work in the direction that you want it to work. It's making software engineers much more productive because you can code much more quickly, much more efficiently with an AI assistant. It's you know, with GitHub's AI assistant, you can you know, you no longer need to it can write code way more quickly than ever before. So we're gonna have productivity gains, we're gonna have displacement, but all of that is part of disruption and part of innovation in an economy. It happened in every platform change that we've ever had historically. And in a dynamic economy, it usually nets out to a gain. It certainly nets out to a productivity gain. And you asked about the impact on inflation.
Yeah.
Well, these things are deflationary because it makes things cheaper. It makes things more efficient. And so over time, companies can bring down prices. And so these are generally technology, and in particular, something like AI that makes things more efficient. They tend to be deflationary over time.
And that was a concern that was brought up, the fact that, yes, inflation has moderated, but it's not fully dissipated per se. And people are still, because the sudden increase that we had in the last couple of years, just adapting to the reality of kind of what prices are today. And so, yeah, hopefully that does kind of help out. Would you say that, and I know it's not the Fed's success story in them creating AI, they had nothing to do with AI, but the goal of the Fed was to raise rates, tighten monetary policy to moderate inflation, and the Goldilocks scenario was a soft landing, which many people thought would be very hard to achieve. But does it look like the Fed got pretty close to a soft landing so far in the US? Or I don't know if it's too early to call, or is it starting to feel more confident that we achieved moderating inflation without causing anarchy per se?
I mean, you certainly can't argue with the results so far. I mean, we've raised rates, inflation has come down. Now it's not at 2%, but it's certainly at an area that is, you know, that within range of that. You know, we're close to 3% inflation, and yet the economy has really not shown any cracks. It's you know, the U.S. economy has been remarkably resilient. We had almost 5% GDP growth in the third quarter of last year, 3.3% in the fourth quarter. Right now, growth is tracking around 2.5%. So it's still very healthy, very, you know, pretty robust. A large part of that, I think, is that you know, actually the U.S. economy just structurally is a little bit less sensitive to rate hikes than we are here in Canada, for instance, because In the US, you do get, first of all, when you have a mortgage in the US, you can sign up for a 30-year mortgage. There's much fewer people who have very variable rate mortgages in the US. It's only 15% of the mortgage stock is of the variable rate variety. Here in Canada, we have about 35% of our mortgages are variable rate. We can only get 5-year terms, so every year, naturally, you get about 20% of the fixed mortgages coming due. So all these people, here in Canada, we have a faster turn rate in terms of refinancing at a higher rate, higher mortgage rate. There in the U.S., it's much slower. So the average mortgage rate in the U.S. being paid is something like 3.6%, which at its peak was much lower than the posted mortgage rates, which were at one point above 8%. So I think that when it comes to higher rates, what you've seen that's reflected in consumer behavior, because where you see weakness is those bigger ticket item purchases where you do have to finance things like automobiles, things like things like solar panels. But to the extent that we have smaller services expenditures, those have remained really resilient. I think people have been willing to pay pretty much anything for a live event. It boggles my mind how much like a Taylor Swift concert costs, or even a sporting ticket. It's really they've really gone up quite a lot, and yet they're sold out. And I think it's just reflective that people are still willing to pay that experience for that experience. Maybe it's some of the effect from the COVID pandemic that you only live once, so to the extent that there's experiential services, those companies have held up very, very well, actually.
I would just add, Mario, that at the beginning of the year, as we all know, people were saying, the Fed may move 5 or 6 times. There was even one person who said 7. So now I think we're in an environment where we don't get any chance of a move until July. And then after July, there's only one meeting before the election. That's mid-September. So we could wind up with only a couple of moves from the Fed. Maybe after the election, they could get a little bit more aggressive. But I think the mantra at the Fed is, what's the rush? There's no rush to move right now.
And by the way,
yeah, go ahead, sir.
But by the way, Mario, higher for longer is not bad for stocks. Okay, so I just want to build on a point that Greg mentioned. So the reason these rate cuts are being priced out or being pushed back is because the economy is strong. It is because the economy has bought the Fed time and wiggle room to wait and see. And actually, when you look at the course of history, what you would see is that the rally in the stock market is positively correlated with the length of the pause. Meaning, when the pause is longer, we've had stronger rallies, and when the pause is shorter and the cuts much more severe, we've had shorter rallies. Actually, when the cuts come, that generally has actually not coincided with the best time for equity markets, because they usually come in response to some sort of economic weakness, in response to a recession, or in anticipation of a recession. And so the market actually has not done well when that happens. But when you have a pause for a period of time, that's usually happening because the economy has been resilient, and so equities do well in that environment.
And I guess one thing for our office, we focus very heavily globally and on the US from like investment philosophy and just how we look at just allocating assets. However, at the same time, I don't want it to be lost that majority of our clients are Canadian, and so they feel the impact of high rates sooner, like you mentioned, mortgages rolling in very quickly. Yeah, for the Americans with 30-year mortgages, they really haven't seen the impact of higher rates. From friends in the US, my understanding is since 2022, housing prices went up in 2022, they went up in 2023, they're doing well and healthy today. Whereas in Canada, it fell like 20%, it was negative, and housing flatlined for 2023, and it's flatlining today. Do you kind of see this divergence between the US and Canada persisting for another 1 or 2 more years, where maybe Canada feels more painful for a while as we kind of go through the cycle, and we kind of have a clamoring for lower rates and kind of Canadian Fed being handcuffed to stay close to the Americans?
Yes, I do actually, and it's for a few reasons. So the first is definitely the structural differences in terms of the sensitivity of Canadian consumers to interest rate hikes versus the U.S. So there's going to be a lot more people here that have to refinance their mortgage at a higher rate and a much quicker pace than there will be in the U.S. That's the first thing. The second is what's been making the news recently in that we've here in Canada we've really sort of lagged in terms of productivity gains in the economy, particularly in the 4 years since the pandemic. And I think part of it has to do with the composition of our economy. In terms of we're in a lot of sectors that are not the most innovative sectors, that are out there. So, and to the extent that, there's a lot of, a big part of the economy is tied up in housing, for instance, that capital is not being reinvested in capital stock, that's not helpful for productivity. So I think actually, Canada, we're kind of skirting around right now. Well, there is one benefit, and that's we're close to the U.S. So, to the extent that U.S. does well, that helps our exports. But I would expect a period of time where, in terms of what's been occurring, the U.S. outperforming Canada, I would expect that to persist for some time.
Right.
I would add, guys, there's one other story, though, that I think is starting to get a lot of traction in the U.S. on housing. That's insurance. Insurance costs have exploded, not just in California, but in many parts of the country. So that is going to be a bit of a negative as we go through the year.
And do you expect that just the idea that maybe there'll be more political pressure to put caps on insurance prices, or just people just generally getting frustrated and kind of blaming the government for higher insurance costs?
Yep, I think that's going to be persistent in a lot of states where governors like Gavin Newsom in California are under tremendous pressure to curb insurance costs. And for a lot of people, insurance costs are up by 40 or 50% just in the last year, both autos and housing. And I think there's going to be a political backlash.
And then I guess staying on the political tone a bit more, we talked about how we're lucky to be next to the Americans because if their economy is strong, even if we're doing poorly as a country, we tend to benefit from it. But given the likelihood that Trump right now is leading, and let's say he's back in office, there was a lot of trade battles between Trump, and it was less a battle, more just him kind of stating he wanted to move a different direction with trade, and we really had to kind of comply with that. Do you think that fight is done with Trump when it comes to NAFTA, since he got his new agreement through the door? Do you think he's going to reopen any of that and just kind of, or is he just going to leave that as a victory that he got in his first administration and focus on China?
Well, I do fear that if Trump wins, U.S.-Canadian relations will suffer significantly. First of all, there's no question that he and Trudeau hate each other. I mean, they really don't like each other, and have made that pretty clear, in my opinion. And then there are other specific issues. For example, the feeling in the U.S. that Canada is not paying enough to NATO. NATO countries are supposed to contribute about 2% of their GDP, and Canada is around 1.4. Trudeau has made it clear he does not want to go higher. That will be a persistent issue. There'll be the issue of the composition of electric vehicles, if Trump wins, he has no enthusiasm for electric vehicles at all. So that's going to be a big issue. And then there's the issue of the border, the northern border, New York, Vermont, New Hampshire, and Canada. That seems to be fractious. But I'd say the main issue is Canada's payments to NATO. And I think that's going to be a big deal if Trump wins.
Yeah. So if Canada has Trudeau in power and Trump's in office, likely not as good for Canada. If Canada has a change of administration on our side, that's more friendly to Trump per se. Do you think relations would be nicer maybe?
They can't be much worse than relations right now between Trudeau and Trump. They really, truly detest each other. And I think if Trudeau calls for elections and we get some in the next year or so, I think if the Conservatives win, that would be a plus. I think Trump and the Conservative would get along better.
Interesting. There was a question that was put in, which I didn't get a chance to ask. And it was more tied back to AI. had to do with basically the working wage. As some people may not be able to adapt to AI, what do you think it's going to impact on wages? Do you think it's going to help improve wages, increase wages across the board? Does it increase productivity, thus allowing companies to earn more income, thus hopefully paying employees more? Or do you think it'll be a dampener to wages?
I think to clarify, I think the question is trying to get at is if we do see, as we kind of mentioned, unemployment or come up from the adoption of AI, that leads to some inability to retrain some segments of society, and will they get left behind? Will we see pressure on something like a working wage in that case to be implemented?
It's hard for me to see displacement of unemployment to the degree where we would need some sort of broad policy on wages. I actually think over the long run it goes the other way, in that people actually get paid more because there's new jobs created that require more specialization, that results in more productivity, that results in better outcomes. So actually, I think in the course of history, generally, that's how innovation tends to play out. Like, you introduce an automobile, and all of a sudden, the horse and carriage that those operators are out of work, but then they retrain themselves. They work in factories, in automobile factories, and they get their wages go up over time. In aggregate, these innovations have tended to be good for the economy, good for workers. In a dynamic economy, there's going to be in the short term displacements, but over a longer period of time, it should end up being good for workers actually, and good for the economy.
Correct.
So I think we're close to wrapping. So I thought maybe one good spot to kind of end with Greg is just circling back to the election again. Obviously, this specific election seems to have all kinds of rhetoric on both sides. So I hope I'm just asking you to kind of cut through the noise a little bit on that. If you listen to one side or the other, doesn't matter which side you want to listen to, the other side's going to end in the result in the end of the US is oftentimes what the narrative else is so extreme, right? So I'm hoping, Greg, you can maybe just cut through the noise a little bit on that for any clients that maybe have that kind of fear on some of that stuff.
Well, it's a legitimate concern that will persist between today and probably beyond November 5th, with continued legal friction with Trump. He has civil cases, he has criminal cases. The criminal cases are such that I think he would pardon himself, believe it or not. If he were elected president, I think that would come pretty quickly. I do think that the other cases, these civil cases, are going to extract an awful lot of money, more money from him, and that will be contentious. So I think it's an environment. I'd be interested in Jonathan's views as well. I think it's an environment that the markets have learned to live with. I think the markets know that we're dysfunctional, that there might be another House Speaker. The House is dysfunctional. That's just politics in America now. And I would tend to think that the markets can get through this and focus on earnings and interest rates and all of the basics that really affect the markets. This is good background noise, but I'm not going to get worried until election day. If it is a messy election and it affects our relations around the world, well, yeah, that's going to be a story to worry about. But for now, I think the markets can survive and prosper with all of this stuff for another few months.
Yeah, I would concur. We're almost desensitized to
Yep.
some of the shenanigans from Trump. Whether you're an investor or not, nobody's surprised anymore. But I would say that the one thing about Trump though is that he does pay attention to the stock market. When he was in power, he was always giving out stats about how well the stock market did, under his administration. So he sees that as a measure of success, and actually as an investor, that's actually generally a positive thing, because he's paying attention to it, and perhaps his policies will try to boost the stock market, since he sees that as a measure of his success. So I think generally in terms of his flamboyant behavior, it's just I think it's just par for the course. Everybody's used to it by now.
And one other quick point I would make. People say, oh, Trump is so radical, he's going to be horrible, it's going to ruin the country. It takes 60 votes in the Senate to get anything done. So if Trump has a radical agenda, I don't think he can get 60 votes in the Senate. He can get 51 or 52. But without 60 votes in the Senate, a lot of this is just hot air.
Yeah. Since you brought up the court cases, there's been some attempts to not allow Trump to be on the ballot, to kind of ban him off the ballot. And it seems like the Supreme Court's overruled any of those options. Do you think there's any more risks, any attempt by the Democrats to just not allow Americans to vote for Trump, and just, or do you think it's too late now? At this point, Trump's a candidate. They're not going to remove him off the ballot.
That's dead. It's not going to happen. And I would just make the point that Trump is brilliant at delay, appeal. He is really the best at that. So he's going to stretch this out, delay this for a long, long time. So as Jonathan and I think, agree, we're going to have to get used to it.
Yeah, perfect. If there's any other questions, feel free to ask. But I also think that you've been extremely generous at your time. At the same time, we don't want to keep everyone here all day because there's an eclipse for everyone. If they want to stare at that instead of politics, neither one is good for you half the time. But yeah, if there's any other questions, feel free to shoot a note. For people that are just listening to a replay, you can always just call myself, Cliff or Mark, for any questions. Shoot us a quick note or an email, and we're happy to answer any questions you might have. Just as a quick recap, our team here at Steel Group, we've been around for quite some time now, and I have to update our photos because I'm getting way more gray beards or hairs in my beard, I guess you could say, but 50 plus years of experience between the three of us here. Assets are growing, markets are growing, and I think overall we're well positioned for a good next few years. I'm feeling actually rather positive. Hopefully from this call, everyone took the general summary that AI and technology will have great benefits to healthcare. And at the end of the day, if we could all be a little bit healthier, it's good for us as a society, good for us individually. Companies will make a few more profits out of that, which is quite nice. So that's quite good. But it won't come without any disruptions. And yeah, we got some people also in the chat saying thank you to the two of you. But yeah, thanks again. And as always, I'm going to stop the recording now, but do reach out at any time if you have any questions. Bye for now.
Thank you so much, everyone.
So long. You bet. So long, Jonathan.